from Music for All and presented by Yamaha. Welcome to teaching social emotional learning through music. And now, here's your host, Scott Edgar.
Hi, and welcome to our next episode of Teaching Social and Emotional Learning Through Music. Today's a special one. Today's a full circle moment that if this person, our guest today, wasn't in my life, none of this would have happened. There wouldn't have been these connections, and certainly it wouldn't be me making these connections. Today we have the honor of having Professor of Music Education from the University of Michigan, Dr. Colleen Conway, as our guest. Colleen, thank you so much for joining.
Very happy to be here.
Colleen, I just have to ask you back to the beginning on a personal note. What was it like for this young band director from Dayton, Ohio to come in and thinking, I really want to explore some of these things that now we're calling social and emotional learning. Back then, I think we were calling it facilitative teaching, but it was like, hey, our kids are coming to us with some of these challenges, and we know this is a hat that our music educators are being asked to wear. What was that like for someone to come in wanting to tackle this subject?
Yeah, it is really interesting to look back because I think it sort of gets us a little bit of a history of, what's going on in teacher education. And I think when you came to the University of Michigan and started saying, these are the kind of things I want to look into, that the faculty response was like, oh, that's interesting. We've not really thought about thinking about what we now know as social and emotional learning. And there certainly was lots of discussion about the relational capacities between students and teachers and making sure that we're people first in the work that we're doing in our teaching. But I don't think we had labels for many of these things. And I remember the early conversations about the dissertation and thinking, wow, this is going to be new, and let's hope it ends up being important. And luckily, it was new and it ended up being important. So we've really come a long way since those first early dissertation discussions.
Absolutely. And just from the bottom of my heart, if I neglect to say this later on, thank you. So
Of
many
course.
of those early conversations about getting me to leave K-12 and come to higher ed are a testament to you and the leadership. And for our guests who may not be familiar with Dr. Conway's work, a seminal leader in teacher education and has been a groundbreaker in many, many areas and a respected member of our community. So it was one of the greatest honors that I had to be able to leave my teaching job in Dayton, Ohio, and come to the University of Michigan. Because of some of the history that you mentioned, yes, we've always centered that relational, and whether we trace that back to some educational theorists such as like Pestalozzi or Montessori, some of that work. In teacher education and the broader field of music education, I think we've seen a shift over the past decade in terms of maybe what have been our priorities, how we've really tried to focus our educational environment. So how have you seen the field of music education change over the last decade?
Yeah, so I want to take on sort of two things. And the first has to do with the field of music teacher education. So if we
Sure.
want to think, we've got music education, and then we've often talked about music teacher education as a field. I'm the editor of the Journal of Music Teacher Education. And I think one of the things that we've seen over the past couple of decades is an expanding understanding of what we actually mean by that word music teacher education. I
Hmm.
think we often look at what we now call pre-service education, or that undergrad or before you become a teacher in the field. We've often sort of poured everything into this kind of bucket of that spot, that undergraduate spot, 4 years, or even if it's a post BA, it's still this kind of spot in between your K-12 education and before you become a teacher. And I think really over the past couple of decades, the scholars in music teacher education have begun to really broaden our understanding of that, to say, well, if we're talking about music teacher education, we have to kind of step back and think, who are the music teacher educators? And in
Hmm.
fact, my last two columns for the JMTE are entitled, Who Are the Music Teacher Educators 1 and Who Are the Music Teacher Educators 2?
Hmm.
And really what I'm trying to get us thinking about is that a teacher is prepared to be a teacher through K through 12 to start with, right?
Right.
So the modeling that our students get, and I think social and emotional learning is something that they are seeing more in their K-12 experience than they were several decades ago.
Mm.
So students are already coming to us having had conversations about belonging, about identity, about self-awareness, self-regulation. I mean, many of these things that are part of SEL our pre-service teachers are now coming, having had these conversations. What I'm curious about as we move forth is, can we find a way for music teachers in K-12 to be seeing themselves as teacher educators for those students who are going on, so that they are really being very transparent with these conversations, and it's not just, well, I experienced this because I had one teacher that did something. And so that group of people is really important. But the other thing I think that we're beginning to realize is that you can't prepare a teacher in 4 years or 3 years or 5 years or however long it takes at the undergraduate level. And I think in the last 20 years, we started to redefine music teacher education to also include teacher learning that happens at the in-service level and teacher professional development. And so I really want to start the whole call with the idea that we have to look at these three kind of phases in the work of teachers and thinking about their learning, and see, how do we embed the tenets of social and emotional learning in all of these ways. And then the second point that I just wanted to make is that when you ask, how has music teacher education changed over 20 years or 30 years, I do have kind of an interesting little insight, because I actually have a group of teachers that I've been studying for over 20 years. So the first time that I took a look at the work of these music teachers was in the fall of 1999. And at the time, they were first year teachers. And my study was really just kind of looking at, what's it like to be a first year teacher? What are the experiences? What are the difficulties? And of course, what came up 20 years ago is, well, it's really hard to be a teacher. And it's not the musical stuff that's the problem. It's the, how do I interact with these students? And, at the time, they were calling it classroom management. I'm just having a really hard time kind of managing the group. And then a funny thing happened, and 10 years went by, and I was able to go back in 2009 and study these teachers again at the 10-year mark, and then just recently in 2019. And one of the key findings really in the 2019 study, I was saying to them essentially what you're asking me. You've been teaching for 20 years, you've been working with student teachers, you've got interns. How are you seeing our field overall changing? I mean, are we preparing today's teachers for the world that you have now been in for 20 years? And one of the key things that came up was this notion that much of their understandings now as veteran teachers are starting to turn towards things like understanding trauma, understanding cultural responsiveness, understanding all of the things that I consider falling under this SEL umbrella in a way.
Mhm.
And many of them said, how I was prepared as a teacher 20 years ago to set good rules and have consequences for those rules is no longer what is appropriate in classrooms. And it's no longer what's expected of in-service teachers. I
Mm.
mean, in-service teachers are now really being expected to get beneath the surface of behaviors that don't seem desirable and
Right.
try to figure out, what is behind this and what's going on. And so I really feel I have the research evidence to say that the expectations of our teachers in K-12 have really moved to a model where whatever your label is, these teachers are being asked to teach things like self-awareness, self-management, and all these things that are a big part of SEL. So I think we can safely say there has been a shift in what's expected. Do I know whether or not there's been a shift in what's happening in teacher education? I don't know yet. I'm in the middle of a study right now that's trying to get at, how are we incorporating these sorts of things into our teacher education programs? And luckily, Scott Edgar's written a couple of books that give us some things to do in our methods classes and throughout. But I feel like it's, I don't know yet empirically to be able to say, and teacher education has made a big change in what we're doing. I think we're seeing that evolve as teacher educators are recognizing that the world that we're preparing these teachers for is a world that's different than 20 years ago.
Absolutely. I think you made a really critical point there that largely we teach how we were taught, that we can't ignore those first 18 years of development before they say, hey, I want to be a music education major. I want to go to Lake Forest College. I want to go to University of Michigan. That they've had models, good, bad, and ugly, for those first 18 years. So you said something very interesting when you were talking about, three big pillars that we talk about that we kind of label under, I would call the bigger label human development. So we talked about SEL, you talked about trauma informed, and you talked about culturally relevant pedagogy. Um, do you feel, and this is a potentially dangerous question that I'm asking, do you feel like putting a name on it has helped or hurt us? So calling it social and emotional learning, calling it trauma informed, calling it culturally relevant, because so many teachers come into this space and they're evolving, they're figuring out what it looks like. And one of the answers that we get often is, well, don't we already do this? And we gently push back on that and say The difference is intentionality. And, I'm kind of in my mind thinking, well, once we name something, then we can be more intentional about it. So my heart says, yes, it helps, but I'm curious your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see both sides of it. I can say in my own work, the number of times that, we're reading something and then I think, well, that's really social and emotional learning. Or maybe I
Hmm.
just don't know enough about what these particular things are. So, I think if we bring it back to undergrads, if
Hmm.
what this is going to be focusing on is like, how do we do this in teacher education? I almost think we need these labels
Hmm.
because otherwise undergrad students kind of check a box very quickly. Oh, okay, it just means being nice to kids. Check.
Sure.
Right. And so I think they need the structure of what, some of these labels can really offer us. I did a study, I think right after the pandemic, actually, with two of, at the time, our doctoral students, and one now teaches at Ball State and the other at the University of Illinois. And we were trying to take a look at the difference between sophomores and juniors in trying to figure out at what point do these young people sort of notice things about the learner that goes beyond music.
Sure.
And at the time in the study, we said we were going to look at musical characteristics of kids, physical characteristics of kids, and then we use the word the social and emotional learning characteristics of kids.
Hmm.
And one of the things that we found was that it was the easiest for them to look at musical things because that's really all they know. They don't really know children at all. And so even just recognizing that, look at that kid's hands are not long enough to get down to sixth position on the trombone or cover the holes were things that they're just unfamiliar with kids, right?
Hmm.
But I think we also found that without some sort of labels within SEL for what are the things that we were looking for, we were watching videos of teachers teaching and trying to have our students talk to one another. Again, it was post-pandemic. They had just had a lot of Zoom-based opportunities. And we were saying, well, let's go back to some of these videos and what kinds of conversations are you seeing between that elementary music teacher and her students in relation to any of these kind of components like self-awareness and management and agency in their learning or whatever. And it was the most difficult one for the sophomores and juniors to kind of recognize. And so to me, if we move too far away, and I recognize there's political context to worry about, but if we
Hmm.
move too far away from, no, this is how this is different from just plain being nice,
Hmm.
then we can't dig really deep into the kinds of lesson planning that they have to learn how to do that is still thinking musical characteristics and still worrying about physical characteristics, but they have to lesson plan and prepare and do curricular alignment in a
Hmm.
way that includes these other things that are equally as important, if not more important to teach.
Absolutely. That's really helpful. And I never thought about it from the perspective of the developmental teacher. We kind of lived, and most of my work, and that's why this talk that we're having right now is so valuable. Most of my work is with in-service teachers. So going in and doing
Yeah.
district professional learning and working with the 5, 10, 15-year vets who are starting to say, well, this wasn't what we talked about when I was in undergrad. So really positioning it in that pre-service space for today. I'm curious, living in the 20-year vet space, so those teachers who are part of your longitudinal study, and by the way, Colleen, you're really one of the only people in our field who is actually doing true longitudinal research. So thank you for that. That takes a lot, and
I
it's a
just
great
got
model.
lucky. They happen to keep teaching, and I happen to just get to stay here.
It's a win for all of us. So thank you for that. For those teachers and understanding that you said like they may or may not be labeling it SEL, and that's okay. How do you feel that they've progressed in learning to meet those students' needs over the last 20 years? They called it classroom management, sure, and now it's more of the things that we've already talked about. How have they progressed in their ability to meet those students' needs?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because really what I heard again and again at this 20-year mark was when I went to this first professional development that we had that was, I don't even remember the names of some of these, snazzy names about, kids with heart and teaching kids with heart and, these kinds of things. They were all kinds of different PD kinds of things they'd been offered. But, a lot of them said in the beginning, wait a minute, this is not how you control the room. And I've got 80 kids and I don't really get how this is going to work. And so they talked a lot about it was a process for them as veteran teachers in starting to realize, gosh, back in the day when I just would send a kid off to the principal because they didn't do what they needed to do, or back in the day when I made the musical goals really the only thing I had on my checklist of things to worry about, I didn't think I was being a bad teacher then, but I realize now that we're in a world where every teacher in the building has to take the responsibility for raising beautiful human beings. And they almost looked back on their early teaching sometimes in with a regret is the wrong word, but just to say, oh wow, I wish I knew now what I knew back then. What I think is interesting is that what I would say I see in our undergraduate students, even our first year students, um, is really almost a demand for us as teacher educators to bring
Mm,
them into this space.
mm,
And, yes, we worry about competition and we worry about sometimes, particularly instrumental music, being not people focused. And yet I'm not seeing that in our students, even at a place like Michigan where they had to race to the top to get in.
right.
Once they're here, I feel like there's this real sense of, I'm not going to be that teacher that's going to go out and kind of slice and dice kids and not teach with heart and not try to understand what's going on with people. I want to bring up to me one of the things, and I'm probably you're going to get to it later, but one of the things that strikes me as I'm thinking about our undergraduate students
Hmm.
is that, we've always talked about the challenge between your identity as a musician and
Hmm.
your identity as a teacher. And we have a lot of literature that says that's our students grapple with that. Their dual degree majors or their flute teacher is, so hard on them that it's hard to think about themselves as music educators. But I think what's even more challenging now is that, we've always had the idea that, well, they're becoming musicians, they're learning to play the flute at the same time as they're trying to learn how to teach. But when we think developmentally about the typical undergrad, and it changes, of course, with age and stage of life, but the typical 18 to 22, now we're saying, not only do you need to have this kind of, frankly, upper adolescence experience in your own social emotional learning and growth and learn to understand yourself and who you are as a person and who you are in your relationships outside of your family, but now we're saying, and also at the same time, you have to get the strategies to learn how to teach your own students to be more reflective and more socially aware and all of these things. And to me, that is really the huge challenge. If you're thinking about the developmental piece, I mean, we laugh, my current grad students and I, all the time when we watch the videos of our students teaching at 19 years old, at 20 years old. And it's easy to be very critical, like, how could they not notice and not stop and change? And that might be musical, physical, or social and emotional learning, right? But then you have to remind yourself, wait a minute, they've been away from home for the first time ever, and there's so many other things they're going through. So again, back to the labeling, I think having the opportunity to describe something as social and emotional learning and divide out those concepts
Hmm.
even helps an undergrad student who's reading that to think about their own social and emotional growth as well as what they might be teaching to somebody else.
It's huge, Colleen, and Kathy Malago and I have had a lot of conversations about how do you scaffold that and understanding that social and emotional growth isn't linear. That some kid may be at a certain developmental point when they're 10, and some people might never get there. And so
Right.
we've talked about what does it look like at different levels in pre-service, and does it look one way in like a foundations course, and then another way in methods courses, another way in field work. And some part of that identity development, especially, I mean, I can think about the anxiety I felt the first time that I had to do an oral skills hearing or something like that, or my first jury. And I really had to check my own social and emotional level, my own anxiety level, my own insecurities as a musician. And it almost felt like when I was in undergrad, that those were two trains running on parallel tracks. It was like, okay, so you're going to
Yeah.
be having to deal with this yourself as a performer, and then we're going to talk about this. And I certainly had my identity and I'll just use the word comfort, aligned much more with a how do I teach this more than how do I do this
Hmm.
myself.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think it's an extra challenge, but again, I think one that our students are demanding. And I also believe, and I can't speak for every university, but at least at my university, the university as a whole
Hmm.
overall is a much more wellness focused space than I
Hmm.
believe it was 20 years ago. Or gosh, if I want to go back, 40 years ago when I was an undergraduate student, when I always tell my students, like, I did my undergrad at Eastman School of Music, and every semester you'd come back and there just would be people that weren't there anymore.
Right.
You just didn't hear about them, and you found out years later that they had, some kind of trauma or a focal dystonia or an injury related to playing. And there was just none of it. Was like, well, if you can't play, you can't be here, right? And so, I think our institutions overall, I mean, I look at that word belonging, especially.
Hmm.
Like, I think higher education is working hard as an institution of higher education to figure out, how do we create spaces within the undergraduate degree outside of music and inside of music that really provide for students so that everybody can feel like they belong. And so, again, coming back to experiencing it yourself as a young person and also learning how to then recreate those things in settings is tricky. I do fear that, just like a lot of things, our students in the next decade are going to walk out of a teacher education program more ready possibly than 10 or 12 years ago to come in and really work with K-12 students in a way that honors these kind of tenets of SEL, and that maybe K-12 schools are going to end up not moving quick enough to be able to handle it.
Mm.
Like, I feel like it's always been our dilemma in music teacher education. It's, we wanted to move towards more creative music making, and we have lots of scholarship and lots of folks wanting to do that, and yet it's still hard within our band, orchestra, choir kind of spots to make that happen. And I fear a little that, we have to continue, and that's where the in-service teacher piece comes in. It's like we have to make sure that we're continuing to help those in-service teachers who may or may not have had this, or they had it, but then they go out to what I call the big black hole of their first year teaching. And even though every bone in their body wants to do, quote, the right thing,
Right.
they walk into a setting where it's difficult to happen. And then 4 or 5 years go by, and next thing you know, they're back with status quo. And so to go back to what I said in the very beginning, like this loop of K-12 teachers and what they're doing to teacher education candidates before they start, what happens in higher ed, what happens in service has to really have some synergy across those phases.
And it almost feels like who budgets first, right? Does higher ed really
Right.
go all in on this and restructure to really build this from the beginning where the job market may not reflect the need for what we're preparing?
Right. Right.
I-
And again, that's not new to the SEL conversation. Like,
No.
I feel like that has been a dilemma for teacher education since the beginning of time, right?
Yeah.
We had these ideas. And I distinctly remember a story. I actually taught at Michigan State before the University of Michigan, which we didn't announce. I didn't wear green today, though. But I remember a moment in a methods class where we were talking about getting to know individual kids, like how the difference between the ensemble mentality and really understanding who your students are, which I now would recognize as a huge part of what, an SEL-based curriculum is about. But in my mind 20 years ago, it was just, you can't run a band unless you know the kids, right?
Right.
But I remember all of my students at the time saying, well, most of my experience in the band or orchestra choir was kind of, collective based, and the teacher knew the choir, but they didn't necessarily know the individuals. And I still remember this one teacher like popping out of his seat and yelling, but we're going to change it. We're going to get out there and we're going to change that. And now I sometimes look back at some of those faces that I see now as 20-year veterans who changed a few things, but often got then sort of wrapped back up into the model that's out there. So, yeah, I mean, the answer to whose job is it really has to be everybody's job.
Right.
And I think it's just kind of like working both things against the middle.
It's interesting. You and I have had this conversation before about how some of maybe our general education students grew up working summer camps, did daycare, were in those spaces where they had more kid face time. And our
Yeah.
music educators were in a practice room working on their instruments. So there is some of that I think we're playing catch up with maybe some of the other content areas.
Yeah, and to bring up Kid FaceTime, that was actually on my list of notes that I wanted to make sure that we get to, because, as you were saying, that when you and Kathy had conversations about, how do we embed these things? How does this developmentally look for a freshman different than a sophomore or a junior or a senior? I just feel so strongly that I've learned over the years that whether we're talking musical characteristics, physical characteristics, or social and emotional kinds of characteristics, void of real kids, I don't think any learning happens. So right at that very first foundations freshman level, there has to be a way to pull children into it. And I know that's challenging. I mean, I travel around enough to know that there's lots of schools where, there just are not robust programs around, or getting kids in and financially is a problem. But I do think that we have to work to make sure that we're not talking about these things at a theoretical level.
Right.
And so whether that's bringing in videos, or having real kids come, or zooming into somebody that's, 80 miles away, but they're showing us real kids, And that was really what my study was about years ago, was like, when we show video of these kinds of interactions, what do these students notice? And really, without prompts from constructs like SEL,
Hmm.
they just notice musical things. Wow, that was really out of tune. Oh my God, those kids weren't sitting up. Oh my gosh, that was not the great sound. I was like, actually, it was a great sound for fifth graders. You just don't know what fifth grade sounds like, right? So yeah, I love the word kid FaceTime, and I think that that is a huge part of this in our teacher education world, and takes more time to teach a class where you bring in students or you take your class out more often and you have to deal with cars and buses and transportation and all these things that, it's a lot easier to come into class and talk at people about social emotional learning and what they should do when they get out there. But I just don't think that works.
No, no, 100%. And it's funny. I don't think we always recognize how mentors work in people's lives. And if it sounds like Colleen and I are using some of the same language, well, that's probably not a coincidence. uh,
That's right. Kid
so,
FaceTime is one of those things.
absolutely, 100%. So, there's one thing that we keep on going back to, and I'd like to explore it a little bit more because there's actually an area of scholarship that we're starting to link in social and emotional learning, and it's a construct called noticing. And,
Mhm.
it's centric to this idea of empathy. If I'm going to be empathetic with someone, if I'm going to have any kind of relation, I'm going to have my radar expanded exponentially to notice what's going on, to be ready to pick up on visual, verbal cues. And, I think that as I think in my world as a teacher, noticing is probably one of the most essential skills that I have to keep sharp.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I would bring the noticing notion back to what we've been talking about in teacher education for forever, which is this, we use the word reflection all the time. We have
Hmm.
to be reflective, right? But when you really dig at reflection in teacher education, we talk about the ability to reflect on your action. So to get the class done and then go back to your office and say, oh gosh, I really should have done this, or this.
Hmm.
Or to watch a video recording of yourself as a student teacher and sit with your university professor and they say, now what do you see, right? You're reflecting on action. What do you notice about what you were doing? And that is all in effort so that somebody can learn how to reflect in action,
Right.
which is what teaching is, right? Teaching is, I'm talking, I'm moving, at the same time I'm noticing
Hmm.
that this particular student looks like they're about to cry, or this particular student looks like they're about to run around the room. And that is a skill that is so hard to learn. And so when you think about scaffolding, that this noticing word that you're using,
Hmm.
I think that's what we were trying to do in our studies. Like, let's take real kids out of it. You don't have to be nervous. You don't have to do anything. You just have to watch this video and tell us what you notice about the behaviors of students. And now I we have things like that in our freshman year class, and we also of course are taking our freshman students, first year students, out and having a shared discussion. What do you notice?
Sure.
When I get my sophomores, I try to scaffold that more towards, okay, now you're going to have 7 weeks in a row where you get to work with a group of 5 or 6 kids in a sectional, and they immediately go to, but oh, I'm a trumpet and these are clarinets, what am I going to do? And I'm constantly coming back to, actually, this is just about kid FaceTime.
Right.
This is you having 18 minutes with a group of clarinet players. Ask them their names, notice some things about them, see what they're like, how do they interact with one another, so that you can learn enough about kids so that when these 7 clarinets are back in the full ensemble, you're really ready to go. And so yeah, I think this is a very interesting intersection. I don't know that noticing literature as well as I would like to, and I think I've heard a few things about it, but it really is an interesting idea that it's kind of step one of being a good teacher, and it's tied to that reflection in action about how do we scaffold what it is I'm supposed to be noticing, and what
Hmm.
are the criteria that show me someone's ability to be self-regulatory or whatever it is. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's interesting right now, especially for our in-service teachers. We're trying to figure out what are the bite-sized ways that we can introduce this, especially if that's not the cloth that they've been cut from. But I'm beginning to think that these bite-sized ways of embedding it into teacher education is going to be just as valuable. And the space that we're living in right now is almost in the what are the reflective questions that we need to ask ourselves? What are the reflective questions we can pose to our students? And sentence starters. If I'm on the podium and I have something that's coming at me, what's my next question? And the
Yeah.
answer is typically we go into fix it mode as opposed
Right.
to engagement mode.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm just old enough that I actually remember when sticky notes were like invented. I mean, they haven't been around forever, but I remember even as an in-service teacher using sticky notes on my score
Mm-hmm.
as a way to get me out of fix-it mode and
Mm-hmm.
get me into this idea that, so I often will say to my students, like, I want me to sit like on your shoulder in 3 or 4 years when you're out there as an in-service teacher saying, couldn't you ask a question instead of telling them what to do, right? And I think that's really what you're getting at. And as a starter, like just as a way of communicating. And then next step is how can that question then be one that leads these students, these fifth graders or eighth graders or 10th graders to understand something about themselves in
Mm-hmm.
relation to what they're about to do and in relation to music making. It's so complex. And what's funny to me is, we said we don't want teachers to just say, oh, I do that already.
Mm-hmm.
But there are definitely people who, without ever having any label for anything,
Yep.
do that already, right? We all know who they are. We call them veteran teachers, but just because you did it for 25 years doesn't mean you're going to be really good at it, right? But we talk about these teachers, and if you go in and you watch someone who is absolutely fabulous, and guess what? Their product is usually fabulous too.
Mm-hmm.
Like the ensemble themselves
Right.
or the general music making, whatever it is usually there. But if you went in with this list of like, here's what SEL looks like, there are people that are really doing this naturally,
Mm-hmm.
but most people are not.
Right.
Most people need these kinds of moments to step back and look inside themselves and figure out who they are in the room, and that's that. But to me, that's hard at 18 to 22 because there's so many other things that they're looking at themselves and trying to figure out.
They're adulting for the first time. Many of them. They're flying. Yeah, I mean,
Right.
there's a safety net in undergrad, but they're adulting. They're experimenting. They're figuring out who they are. Their identity is no longer that of where they've come from, largely. It's interesting. You said something very profound. Everything you say is profound, but the last thing that you said that really stuck with me was that the product, and we talk about process and product a lot, and where do we put the value in both, and my 2 cents is that we have painted ourselves into a corner of performance being the end all be all,
Hmm.
but I guess I have a big question for you: is how do we get beyond this idea that the performance is what it is, because it's a giant leap of faith, and it comes down to time, it comes down to pressure for concerts, it comes down to, you know what, I have 8 weeks to prepare for this concert, I have 8 weeks to prepare for evaluation, I have 8 weeks to prepare for UIL, and I'm going to go out there. How do I have time to do everything you're talking about, Scott? This identity work, this belonging work, this agency work.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. My answer to that is like, well, how could you have time to do anything else, right? I
Right.
mean, so I think back to, early on in my career, I used to do a lot of conversations about, really instilling musicianship instead of just, EGBDF and FACE, and let's get off the page and let's make sure that the music's on the inside, right?
Sure.
And I can still see a couple of people that used to come to my sessions and say, great idea, but how could I possibly have time? I don't have time to teach them to actually feel the music and hear the music because I've got to put on this concert. And I used to always say the same thing. Well, why would you put on a concert if they can't feel and hear the music? It's going to be out of tune and it's going to be in bad rhythm and it's not going to be what you want. And I kind of feel the same way now around what your job is as an educator.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you are a music educator, but really you're a people educator. You're a
Mm-hmm.
child educator using music. And so I think we just have to create a next generation of teachers who recognize this kind of person first. And I am seeing it. What I fear a little bit is that what we're seeing is students saying, I don't want to do high school because I'm afraid I can't be the teacher I want to be if I do high school. And,
Whoa.
in the middle of a country where we're in a big teacher shortage, if all the best and brightest start to say, I don't want to do that. And I think that's a thing to worry about a little bit is that, we have to really make sure that we help our students understand, like, look, you love marching band and you love whole suites and want to sing Mozart or whatever. You can do those things and do this at the high school as well. You can navigate that. It may be hard work, but it's worthwhile work, right? Like to have great performances without heart is not a great performance.
Holy
And so,
cow.
but
Ugh.
it's yeah,
My mind's
it's
blown
hard
right
work.
now because I mean I think back to, and I'm gonna give you a old fogey Scott moment now. And it's like, okay, so like 15 years ago, when students came out of high school, they all wanted to be high school band choir or orchestra directors because that's the experience that they had most recently. The rep they wanted to work on was that whole suite, was that Eric Whitaker, because that's what was in their heart. It wasn't more of the middle
Yeah.
school or elementary. So are you seeing a pendulum shift in that area?
I mean, in my small little end of however many you might say at the University of Michigan. But the other thing I would say that goes along with that is I'm seeing a lot more students who say, "Oh, I don't want to go back to big suburbia," which is where I came from. That's what got
Mm,
me into Michigan. I had private lessons since I was two, and
hmm.
actually, I want to go to a program that needs me more than that. And we're definitely seeing that as a shift, I would say.
Mm,
And I think that is a related to SEL kind of shift. I'm
sure.
getting bit by this bug that I want to do things for people.
Hmm.
And, if I can, I'm going to offer my services to people who are really, really not having these opportunities. That I would say is a shift I've definitely seen. And, to speak to the high school or not, I'm serving on a NAFME teacher education task force right now. And actually, one of the things that came up at the very first meeting, because we're talking about teacher shortages, right,
Hmm.
was other people sharing this notion that fewer students are saying they want to go into high school settings, and
Mm.
it's hard to know, is it this issue, is it that they don't feel like they can do the work they want to do, or is it something else? But if that's a shift, that's a concern.
100%. So, I'm so glad you just brought up and the work that you're doing with NAFME. Obviously, we're in a national teacher shortage, and that's at all levels. Um, Two-part question. One, when you start to see some of your students saying, "Hey, I want to go and help students who may be a little bit more in need, not from my background," are you seeing that? Because typically my mind goes to, well, I may want to go into an urban setting. I want to go, in your from where you are in Ann Arbor, maybe I want to go teach in Detroit. Are you seeing it in rural too, though? Are some students, because that I see that environment as being very high need now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think in where I am in Ann Arbor, you can, drive 30 miles in either direction and get to all of these things, right? And
Hmm.
so I think we are seeing students and back to kid FaceTime, I try really hard to make sure that the kid FaceTime that I provide for my students includes these communities from all over, right? So, we don't measure free and reduced lunch anymore, but one of the groups I just brought in recently, back in the day, was 98% free and reduced lunch, with the teachers telling me that these are kids who, for the most part, neither parent has a regular job. They're seasonal work and these kinds of things, and they're not from a city, right? They're from rural Michigan, and so I think we are seeing that a little bit of that. And I just did a little bit of traveling out to Montana this semester, and there was a lot of conversation about the rural education piece there, with same kind of thing. Like, there's a couple of really great cities in Montana where you can get these big suburban programs, but a lot of the undergrad students saying, no, I think I want to get out and provide this in other kinds of places. So I think that may be a trend.
Mm. And certainly a needed trend. The second part to my question is, and we were just having a conversation. So part of one of the hats I wear is with the Center for Arts Education, Social and Emotional Learning, and we convened a senior advisory board, and we were talking about the teacher shortage and what is the intersection between social and emotional learning at all levels, pre-service, in-service, early career, mid-career, late career, and addressing the teacher shortage. Are there any intersections that pop into your mind, connections between SEL and addressing the teacher shortage?
I mean, one of them won't be a popular answer, but one of them is that in the midst of a teacher shortage, maybe we need to broaden our view of what teacher preparation is and can be,
Hmm.
and that you don't have to be 18 years old having come out of a band orchestra choir in order to get into the teacher education program. But there are certainly lots of other kinds of music making that can get someone into teacher preparation. And to me, that has an intersection with SEL, because so often the kind of student who is going to come in who's not sort of your band orchestra choir person is someone that's been making music in environments that are much more collaborative. They're much more protective of one another in their band or whatever it might, in their rock band or whatever it might be. And so I think there's a population out there who their type of music making has already been in a different way of thinking about how we do this. And so, there's a lot of talk right now about the pipeline and how do we assure that we're getting all of the right people in. That's intersection one. The other intersection is thinking about the alternative certification models that are going to need to be in place in order to get teachers out there. Maybe when we look at someone for a quick fix alt cert, one of the
Hmm.
characteristics or some of the characteristics we're trying to understand is, are they a 42-year-old parent of three who are coming in and already having some understandings of some of the kinds of things that SEL lead us to think about
Hmm.
that will put them actually ahead of the game. Yes,
Hmm.
they have some catch up to do in some other ways, but if we can see what is it that actually makes that it of a good teacher, there's no doubt that this social emotional learning piece is a part of it. And so again, the alternative certification one's a little less popular with those of us that are in higher education, but we also recognize that we can't do it. We can't staff the need that is going to be as it continues to increase. And so we need to be broader in thinking, if we want to allow alternative certification, how do we prioritize the fact that the SEL characteristics of that person coming in might be actually more important than how well they can make a new read on the oboe.
Hmm. Absolutely. And I mean, that's obviously the flag that we're flying. So I have a big question because this is something that I think we're struggling with now, and it's largely based upon funders. But everyone wants to see, if you're going to do something, you better be able to show that it's working and that it's advancing the cause. And we're actually finding that there are some districts who are starting to think about teacher evaluation in terms of SEL, and we're pushing back on that. We think that we can look in terms of the intentionality, the planning, but we can't say the effect of a
Measure it,
teacher.
right? Yeah.
Measure it. Say Johnny was 30% self-aware, and now he's 60% self-aware, and good job. And then tie teacher pay to that. That doesn't cut it. But so much of what we're talking about right now is, yes, we talk about knowledge, skills, dispositions. I want to live in that disposition world for just a few minutes, in terms of,
Yeah.
maybe how our pre-service music educators, you talked about, they're coming in and they're demanding this. This is what they're feeling needs to be part of this. How has that change in disposition affected maybe how you do your job?
Yeah, actually, I'll come to that second. I want to go after the teacher evaluation piece a little bit,
Please.
because the dispositional piece to me has always been a challenge for teacher education,
Hmm.
right? We've always tried to figure out, how do we have students here for 2 years and then do a sophomore screen where we say, I don't think you have the disposition to be a teacher, right? That has been such a challenge for all of teacher ed, because we have this idea that, yeah, by the time they've been here a couple of years, if they're not showing certain kinds of care for children or noticing about the people in the room,
Hmm.
that maybe that's not, who we wanted. But over 20, 30 years, we've never been able to really put something in place for that, because you can't really measure it. And how do you tell a 19 or 20-year-old, no, you don't have what it's going to take for the rest of your life? So this whole piece of how we measure
Hmm.
this thing that we're talking about, I think, is a challenge. It's not new, though, because the whole aesthetic piece of what we are about in the arts has also always been a challenge for us. How can we prove to our institutions that our kids are learning things?
Hmm.
And most of the time when we go to do that, we prove silly things like, I never taught key signatures, and I gave them a pretest that said they don't know two sharps in the key of D. Then I taught key signatures, and now they do. So the
Right.
ability to measure this kind of emotional connection, whether it's emotion in music or whether it's identity and understanding of yourself, those two things are, I think, always really, really challenging to get at. In answer to, if our students are demanding this, what does that mean for teacher education? And I guess, to me, the obvious thing is, it means that every aspect of not only the undergraduate program, but also what happens in-service teacher professional development and teacher learning opportunities really has to have this be a key.
Hmm.
It has to be a part of everything we do. Every session that a teacher goes to at a state conference should have some element, whatever they're talking about, even if it's how do you get the clarinets over the break. Every one of the things that are in these things have to have this element of, and how are you going to do this in a way that honors the individual learners in the room?
Hmm. And that's so hard, especially,
Right.
we talk about those new teachers, those pre-service teachers who are coming in, and it is that, I think about the Intro to Music Ed book that Mike Raber and Dave Teachout wrote, and it's all about identity from musician to teacher, and it's
Yep.
all me centric. It starts me centric. I have to figure out, what am I going to do? What am I going to say? How am I going to notice, to then
Right.
realize that I'm noticing something.
Yeah. Yeah. And back to the identity thing, I think the other thing that has changed in our students is in the K-12 world in some places in the country. They
Hmm.
have done a very good job of helping kids start as early as middle school to understand identity and understand other people's identity and recognize who you are and celebrate who you are and not judge someone who looks like they're different than you, right? I mean, we have seen a much bigger focus on that in K-12. And so, maybe in a perfect world, our students are going to start coming to us with a better understanding of all of that we can then just build on. But
Hmm.
we know we're kind of in a fight for that right now at the K-12 level, and that means that it will affect us in higher education as well.
Yeah, either we're going to dig our heels in and follow our moral compass and figure out how, but it's real. And there are, as I travel the country, the receptivity to this is very diverse. But
Yeah.
I think I firmly do believe that no matter where you are in this country, a lot of this dialogue is at an administrative and above level, that teachers always understand that they're interacting with human beings and they're starved for tools, for
Right.
ideas on how to relate individually to students.
Agree for sure.
Yeah. So moving forward, where I'm going to ask you to crystal ball for 2 seconds. Where do you
Oh,
see?
goody. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the longitudinal work that you've done, it gives us such perspective. So prognosticate, hypothesize where we're going to go. Where do you see SEL in 10 years? Where do you see
Yeah.
music education leading? And I'm going to ask you to, you did a brilliant job of this at the beginning of kind of parsing out music education and music teacher education. So where do you see music education in 10 years, and where do you see music teacher education in 10 years?
Sure. So, it's funny when I left one of my interviews in 2019 with a 20-year veteran that I had been to every 10 years. On the way out the door, literally, he said, I'll see you in 10 years, right? I'll see you at the 30-year mark, which, would be 2029. So I've definitely thought about it before. And, just like anything, there's the ideal picture. And that's the picture I'd like to paint is that, you are doing work in a way that's hard right now, kind of beating your head against the wall to make sure that the label doesn't then just remove all of these things that we just know are so important,
Hmm.
and it's politically charged for whatever reason. But I have to believe, again, the veteran teachers that I talked to in 2019 were all saying, "Gosh, 10 years from now, I'll be just about ready to retire." And, I hope they were literally saying, I hope that the things that we talked about today and how the expectation for teachers has changed to know individuals better, to understand the trauma that might be behind something, to help everybody in the room, to understand that everybody belongs, and to wipe out bullying in the band room forever. These are the kinds of things that they were saying that they hope we can get to the place. I think we will get to that place because, again, I think our current teacher education students are only want to teach in an environment that's going to look like that. So that's the cheery version. I mean, the not cheery version is that they all don't go teach because the space of teaching becomes a place that nobody wants to be. But even if that happens, there's a rock bottom that has to build up from somewhere. And to me, the only answer to build up will be, well, the people that do want to teach in an environment where the components of SEL are at the forefront, and
Hmm.
an acknowledgement that if those things are in place well, the high level music making will happen. Like
Right.
these things are but it doesn't go the other way. You can get the appearance of high level music making and have a lot of people being hurt in the process. And I don't think anybody wants to see a world that looks like that.
And we've all been there. I've been in classrooms where it's like, yeah, I did that. I did that out of fear. I achieved a
Right.
really high level out of fear, and fear can work. But those aren't the teachers that I go
Yeah.
back and say hi to.
Yeah. I mean, and I have to come back to, I don't actually believe that any teacher is like a horrible person. I think part of it has to do with the context and the environment.
Sure.
So, if you're teaching a class load where you're in three schools and you don't have any time to ever have any interaction with your colleagues or your students or whatever, like some of it is the context itself. And so that's another whole kind of policy piece that has to come into place, is that we
Sure.
have to provide a space for in-service teachers to be able to have the dispositions and know themselves well enough and understand these things, and that takes time and reflection and conversation with your colleagues. And so many of our settings right now don't look like that. So, I mean, I often think when I see teachers doing things and I'm like, oh, I would never do that. I have to back myself up and realize, well, but let's look at the rest of the day and what their day looked like
Right.
and how much they didn't have the opportunity to plan lessons and plan curriculum beyond pick up a score and run. And so I think that's the system itself goes way beyond just the people.
It has to. I mean, we have to see this as systemic, and that's what makes it so hard when we talk about the politicization of SEL and whatnot. I've been watching Abbott Elementary. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's
I've seen a few episodes, yeah.
it's my guilty pleasure right now. So every night I'll watch just a couple episodes as I'm playing catch up. But exactly what you just said is like teachers are part of a community, part of an environment, part of a culture. And it's one of two ways. Either the teacher's going to maintain their identity or they're going to become part of the bigger picture. And I firmly believe that when we talk about identity, belonging, and especially that third part of SEL, agency, that it
Yeah.
matters for teachers to have that agency too, so that they're
Right.
fighting falling into, well, as you put, that black hole.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Again, it's a good loop back around to every part, this K-12 part, they're all teacher educators. If we're trying to decide, who is it that's preparing teachers, it's literally that first kindergarten general music teacher. I mean, the kids come to me, the 18-year-olds come to college, they don't remember that kindergarten general music teacher necessarily, but then when I start to pick at some of what's in their musicianship, I regularly will hear, oh, I kind of remember something like that when I was in kindergarten and first grade. Right? Already they were being put in a certain direction. And so we all have to be worrying about it for sure.
Absolutely. Well, I think everyone can see that Dr. Conway has just so much wealth of experience and understanding of where music education has been and hopefully where it's going to go. I do just want to pause and just say that, Dr. Conway has shepherded many, many people through the PhD program. And when I look at the content, of what the people who have gone to Michigan have chosen to explore. It's very much in that humanity, so much in that humanitarian, human development space. And I think that's a testament
Yeah.
to your heart, to what you prize, and your ability to nurture that next generation of music teacher educators.
Thanks. Yeah, that's another whole group. How do you prepare the people to teach the teacher educators?
You
So,
got it.
yeah.
And,
Well, I appreciate the compliments. Thank you.
Absolutely, and that sort of brings up just the last piece is that we just released a new book through GIA Publications that Dr. Conway wrote the foreword to, and that's Portraits of Social and Emotional Learning in Music Teacher Education. So that next level up, how can we really start to think about how we can do this work developmentally, much more from a individual, I'm building these skills myself, and then scaffolding up to I'm going to learn how to eventually teach these with my future students. So,
Yeah, it's great stuff. I was honored to write the forward.
fantastic job. It was so. I'll finish with how I started with just a huge word of gratitude. We all need people in our lives to help open doors, and you have opened up so many doors for so many, me especially. And it's just an honor to share this space and have this conversation. My friend, my colleague, and my mentor,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Colleen, for spending a little bit of time with us today.
Well, thank you for the really important work and the opportunity to talk about it. So, congratulations.
Thank you so very much. For Music for All, I'm Scott Edgar. Have a great day.